the long-awaited three parts, or is it three parts of morality. I know some professors who refuse to teach on this. I'm biased, but I'm fair. Now, this is a short reading. The three parts of morality is actually taken, as you can see here when I scroll down, it's taken from Mere Christianity, Book 3, Chapter 1. In Mere Christianity, this is one of C.S. Lewis's most famous books, especially his nonfiction. Of course, you know C.S. Lewis as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, A Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and things like that. But he wrote a ton of things. He wasn't just a children's author. In fact, for his day job, he was a professor of literature, English literature, and classics at Oxford and at Cambridge. And so he was very well educated and knew his stuff. So for this book, one of his most famous nonfiction books, this actually began as radio talks. And during World War II, you see, Lewis was himself a soldier in World War I. And by the time World War II rolls around, he's a bit too old to be in combat. And by that time, he had a university career. But he was so well known, his name was so well known that he had been asked to give a defense or explanation of Christianity, like what do Christians believe, on the radio during the war. And so that's what became these talks became what we now know as this book, Mere Christianity. Now, this, as I said, is an excerpt of that. Now, the three parts of morality, Lewis doesn't necessarily, he doesn't invent these three parts of morality. I think he's drawing these three parts of morality from Thomas Aquinas, and they may even predate Aquinas, maybe even earlier than that. But let's take a look. But I chose Lewis, especially when I teach this in my classes, because he's so well worded. He explains things so well, and he's very readable, as you can see when we dive in. So he says here, there are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift from one another, apart from one another, or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating and bullying. The other, first of all, why is he talking about two ways? You might be like, well, I thought you were going to give me three ways. Well, he'll talk about that in a second. He's going to say, okay, there's two ways here, but then one thing we haven't talked about yet. So first he starts with a two, it's just a rhetorical strategy here. So two ways. One, how does the human machine go wrong? When we drift apart from each other or collide into one another. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual. And he gives two really interesting analogies or metaphors. He says, you can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation along a voyage. So that's one way you could think of it. Or you might think of it as humanity is a band playing a tune. So let me take this one at a time. It says, keeping those two ways the human machine can go wrong in mind, he says, fleet of ships. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has their engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you can't have either of these two things without the other. Let me pull us over here. I've got notes over here. And if we're to think of the three parts of morality, let's just start listing them so that we don't lose track. All right. And in fact, I'm going to skip ahead and use Lewis's wording himself. So he says morality then seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. It takes him a while to get there, a couple paragraphs, but he eventually gets there. So let's pull us over here and let's say that number one, the first part of morality, is fair play and harmony. I'm going to abbreviate between individuals. And then secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing, harmony within each individual. He uses a Britishism here to tidying up and harmony. There he uses it again, harmony or harmonizing within each individual. Okay. Then I'll go ahead and I'll skip to the third. He says, thirdly, that it also should be concerned with as he says here, the general purpose of human life as a whole. General purpose of human life as a whole. So it takes a little bit of explaining to do. But you can already see, you can already see that these start to manifest and, become apparent here based on what we've said so far. So let's go back to our first analogy. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships don't collide and get in one another's way. That's that. Number one, fair play and harmony between individuals. You don't want to hurt each other. You don't want to harm each other. In fact, we could add as, a little note here under number one, we could say no harm to others. Okay. But let's add something else, because up here he says one is when human drift apart from another or collide with one another and do other damage by cheating, bullying. Okay, that takes into account like the harm. Don't do that, right? But it's more than just not harming each other. It's living in harmony with one another. So we don't even want to drift apart, because again, if you think of this as a voyage, you need to keep your ships tight together, but not bumping into each other. So not just not harm to others, but also do good to others, right? Okay, so that would be that part of the analogy. Then he says this, and secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has their engines in good order, okay, that would be the tidying up and harmony. That would be here. That would be what does he mean by, what could we put here? Well, he means here, if you have your own house in order, if you are good if you got your steering rigged properly, your sails rigged properly, your engines, as he says, in good order. And why would that matter? Because he says it's a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. That is, if you keep hurting one another, back over my nose, if you keep harming one another, this second part is going to be affected. It's going to hurt your seaworthiness. But, he says, on the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. If you don't have this part of morality, if you don't have it, if it's out of whack, if you are not whatever this is, we'll say more about, then you will inevitably crash into each other and harm another person. And so, another analogy he uses here before we fill out the rest of that is this. He says, humanity is a band playing a tune. To get a good result, you need two things. Each player's individual instrument must be in tune, right? That would be the second part. You've got to have your own house in order. But also, each must come in the right moment so as to combine with all the others, right? That would be the harmony between the individuals. Harmony within the individual, and then harmony between individuals. So here, following the parallel notes that we've already laid out, we could say this is no harm to oneself. Let's just say self. And also good to self. Now, here's the interesting thing, because that harm right there, you might think, yeah, well, certainly I shouldn't hurt myself. You might be thinking of self-harm in the sense of physical, but this is 3 parts of morality, remember. This is morality. This has nothing to do with physical harm. So I at this point, I ask students, I say, what could this mean? Here we could ask ourselves a question. Let's just start here. Question. This is physical harm. He doesn't mean that, because again, this is 3 parts of morality, not 3 parts of physicality. This is not physical harm. This is moral harm. And then that immediately introduces the question, what does it mean to morally harm yourself? Can I morally harm myself? That seems like a really odd category of action, to morally harm myself. Now, I usually at this point open it up to the students. I say, what could this mean? Like, well, give me some examples of this, if you can think of any. And, we hem and we haw. We're like, well, I don't know, so, but we eventually come around to this, like, so we get our lead by thinking about harm, first of all, right? I can harm another person, obviously, physically. Let's just start with like other people first, and then we'll talk about myself, and then we'll talk about just moral. Okay. So like physical harm, obviously I can physically harm a person, like I slap them in the face or something worse, right? But obviously I can also do that to myself. I can physically harm myself. Okay. But can't I also harm a person, morally speaking, like in other words, wrong a person, and yet they're not hurt physically? And I think that I can, right? So like I can harm a person or wrong a person, offend a person, certainly by not even hurting them physically. Like I can cheat them, I can betray them, I can lie to them, right? That would be if I were to harm another person. But still, like, what if that's applied to myself? That still seems weird if I apply to myself this idea of harming myself morally. Can I betray myself? Yeah. Like if I have certain deeply held moral convictions and I fail to hold those, in a certain really, intense situation where I'm tested, then yeah, I could betray myself morally. I could lack integrity. I could not be whole. I could lie to myself. I could maybe cheat myself out of a certain good thing. And I can also fail to do bad things to myself, right? Because this also encompasses this. This is not just a good, like I get, a bonus at work or, I'm winning big or something. No, this is a moral good to myself. So I could also fail to do that. In other words, this encompasses the virtues. The idea that I should continually be doing good to in the sense of growth. Again, remember, this is harmony, tidying up, right? Making sure my steering gear is in order, making sure that I am, everything I need in order to not collide into other ships and then to get my place, to the place I need to go. So, I need to also be doing good to self. This can also be considered as collecting the virtues. Things like humility, honesty, gratitude, kindness, so on and so on, will help me become the kind of person that has his house in order and can achieve this and can treat others well. Now, that's all well and good, but we haven't yet talked about this. This is the hardest one, I think. And in fact, so you could think of these, by the way, this one you could think of as these all take on a sort of characteristic, like each one of these levels. I'll just do this as if I'm writing on the board, right? So that kind of points to the first one, that points to the second one, that points to the third one. So this one, he says later on in the reading that each one of these levels, each one of these parts of morality concerns man's relationship with something else. So obviously the first one is man's relationship with, as we can see right there, man's relationship with others. This one, number 2, that is, because again, these are just a bit staggered. So this one would be here. This one concerns man's relationship with himself. Okay, that's pretty easy to see as well here. Third one here, what does this have to do with? Well, this is the mysterious part of morality, but it's the very, very important one. So this one concerns, as C.S. Lewis words it, he says, this one concerns man's relationship with the power that created him, with all of creation. So this is going to concern one's relationship with God or Creator, right? Whether there is one, and if there is, what to do about that, okay? But he'll explain that here in our next paragraph. He says, because we've already talked about 1 and 2, we're on to second paragraph. He says, but the third thing, there's one thing we've not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to, or what piece of music the band is trying to play. The instruments might all be in tune, they might all come in at the right moment, but even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and actually played like funeral music. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and instead actually arrived in Calcutta, India. That would be a failure. Morality, then, it seems to be concerned with three things. And then he gives us three things. What course the whole fleet ought to be on, what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. In other words, this third part concerns why are you doing these other two parts? Like, I can play nice and be nice to other people. I can be nice to myself and, build myself up, collect all the virtues and be a good person. But like, why? Why does that matter? Why does it matter? Well, I need to know why I'm doing these things. Why should I be nice to other people? And you might think, well, that's just intuitive. You just should. That's not good enough. You need because different answers to this should also concern your worldview here. And your worldview informs all the other things you do because it's the lens through which you view everything else, right? So, for example, if he'll later say in the reading, if I'm a Christian, then I'm sort of the renter of my body and my life and my purpose and everything. There is an owner. I'm not my own. The Bible teaches this. And that changes how I view the things I do in this world. Like, I'm responsible to somebody else, just like I'd be responsible. I wouldn't just, paint the floors or the outside of the house just a garish, ugly color without consulting the landlord first. It's not my property. And so the same thing, if I do believe that I'm not my own and I have a creator who made me and I'm ultimately responsible to him, then that changes everything. It changes how I view others, changes how I view myself. But alternatively, let's say if I think that there is no such creator, that atheism is true, that God doesn't exist, then this changes maybe how I treat other people and how I go about, tidying up my own house. Let's say, if there is no afterlife, because again, this encompasses one's entire worldview. If there's no afterlife, God doesn't exist, then, well, I'm not ultimately going to be judged. So I just got to kind of dodge the things that, are going to hold me accountable in this world. Like, I don't want to go to prison, or jail, or anything. I don't want to have anybody seek revenge on me. So I'll make sure that, I'm not caught. But it could be to my advantage. If it could be to my advantage to do something wrong and never get caught or never be punished, then I might as well do that. And so that's going to affect how I treat others, how I treat myself, because at the same time that I take advantage of people, I become a certain kind of person. And because I don't think there's a creator, let me give you another really good example of this, one that you might not see as very apparent. So statistically speaking, this is actually true. Statistically speaking, evangelical Christians are, as a demographic, are unlikely to support environmental concerns, environmental ethics, things like fracking, deforestation, big oil, going electric and all that stuff, and the ozone layer, all these sort of things, pollution. Of course, you can see like that involves this, of course, like harmony with others and playing with taking care of, being good stewards of the earth and so on and so on. But as a demographic, they're really not concerned about that thing. Once I explain to you why, you'll be like, oh, that makes sense. Because as I've been saying, your answer here down at number 3, it informs why you do the things you do the way you do them up in 1 and 2. So why is it that they don't care about environmental issues? Well, it has to do with their worldview, it has to do with their view of the afterlife. And you may have guessed this, maybe, but it has to do with their view of the afterlife. Evangelical Christians, in their theology, they think that, of course, they're going to heaven, there might be a rapture, and in which case I'm just kind of plucked out of here and I'm gone, and I don't really have to be responsible for the world I leave behind. But more than that, they believe, as the Bible says, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So if there's going to be a new earth, then that changes how I treat the earth. Again, we're talking about environmental issues right here. That changes what I think about pollution, fracking, and so on and so on. If we're just going to get a new one, like we're just going to get a reset, a redo, it doesn't matter as much what I do. So the thinking goes, what I do down here with this one now. Alternatively, if you thought that this was the only Earth that you would ever get, and once it's gone, well, like that would be the worldview that informs you. And well, that worldview would make a difference as to what you do at this level one. Like, am I going to take care of the Earth? Am I going to care about environmental issues and try to change things there? So it's not always obvious, but once those assumptions, those deeply held assumptions in one's worldview are laid bare and made apparent, made obvious, and then you can see why people down here holding a certain worldview, deeply held worldview, why and how it actually changes the way things are done at this first level. It's really quite fascinating. So, all right, let's keep going. Now, this one right here, this is going to be a really important one, the first part of morality. Let's see why. As we keep going, he says, you may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. When people say in the newspapers we're striving for Christian moral standards, they usually mean we're striving for kindness, fair play between nations, class, individuals. Okay, they're only thinking of the first thing, and you might always still hear this again. This was written almost 100 years ago now, and he says here, when a man says something he wants to do about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else harm. Like, I need a nickel for every time I've heard that. Well, what's wrong with it? It can't be wrong because it doesn't hurt anybody else. He's thinking only about the first thing, right? Like, it's as if these two don't exist. Like, as long as I satisfy things here and make sure that I'm not hurting others, I'm good to others, helping them and so on. So if there's some like nasty thing I do, which I wonder if you can think of one before I get done talking, but if there's some nasty thing I'm doing, it may be corrupting my soul, or it may, at this third level, be something that's just not conducive to human nature, then, well, as long as it's not hurting anybody, who cares, right? We're not hurting anybody, so who cares? Why do people care? Why does the government care? You might hear it this way. What I do in the privacy of my own home. And so here are some examples. And at this point, I ask students, I'm saying, well, could you think of any examples of things that are wrong, even though they don't hurt anybody? And of course, they think of examples that are like, you could lie about somebody or destroy somebody's reputation, even though it doesn't hurt them, right? And that's true, but like, that's only not hurting them only because that person doesn't know about it. Like, they're just not aware. Like, you talk bad about them, they're not aware. But I'm thinking, like, forget about the interaction between people. I want to know, like, can you do something wrong, even though it's not hurting anybody at all, whether they know it or not? Like, it wouldn't hurt them even if they did know about it, but it'd still be wrong. And so some people would say, yeah, you could. Some example, well, I think that is the truth. You could, but some examples that people will give is this. Things like pornography. Even if that's not hurting anybody else, that could still be wrong, right? Because 2, you could be harming yourself, destroying your soul. And then 3, you could look at it as, well, that's just not, given the way that God has created us, that's just not conducive to, you could throw in masturbations here as well. It's just not conducive to the natural order of things, the way that God's created us, which is to express love between each other. You could throw in homosexual sex in here as well, gay marriage. Those are things that people will give examples to say, well, it doesn't hurt anybody. Why does the government, why do conservative Christians care about what I do inside the privacy of my own home? Well, it's not that they care about it in the sense that it's hurting them. It's not hurting other people. So if you think that that's all there is to morality, first of all, you're wrong. But if you think that's all there is to morality, then that's the only way you get that answer. That the whole idea of like, well, as long as it's not hurting anybody, then I'm fine. But there is all kinds of ways to do harm to yourself. Just think of, like, not even in the moral example. I could harm myself, not morally speaking, but I could certainly harm myself. I could punch myself. I could do self-harm. I could cut, those sorts of things. I could, starve. I could, fail to take my medication. I could sleep all day. I could become just a terrible wretch of a person. Which and that feed bleeds into here, right? Because that's just not how God wants me to be. That's not how, even if you're an atheist, that you might think, well, gosh, you need a better purpose than that. So like, it's not just with respect to as long as I'm not hurting anybody, right? Because I could destroy my life here. I could even do drugs and drink myself to death, as long as I'm not hurting anybody else, right? But this can't be all that there is with respect to morality, as long as I'm not hurting anybody. That can't be all that there is. So that's what Lewis is saying over here in the reading. He says, when a man says that, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, he's thinking only of the first thing. He's thinking it does not matter what his ship is like inside, provided that he does not run to the next ship. Okay. Now, he does say this is excusable. It's understandable why people would think this. He says it's quite natural when we start thinking about morality to begin with the first thing, and there are actually two reasons. He says, first thing with social relations. For one thing, the results of bad morality in that sphere are so obvious and press on us every day. War, poverty, graft, lies, and shoddy work. Okay, that's the first reason why we start with this, because it's so obvious, right? Right here, if things go wrong in this level, this sphere, like, it is really obvious when somebody's been hurt or harmed, morally speaking, or just physically speaking. Morally and physically can also be combined together. So if I stab someone, obviously, that's going to be a physical harm, but it's also going to be a wrong. It's going to be a moral harm as well. Violating their autonomy or something, or expressing power over them, which, is a moral wrong. So he says it's really obvious when things go wrong at this level, right? Let's use the example I just used to stab someone. Like, it's really obvious if I stab someone, but here at this level, whether I have a certain virtue or something, that's not as obvious. Like, whether I have integrity, I don't know. I can't even tell. Like, I can't tell if other people have it. I can't even tell if I have integrity, because virtues are really hard to assess and identify and to cultivate and develop. And even within oneself, you know yourself more than you know anybody else, better than anybody else. So it's not obvious, a lot more obvious, when something external happens. So he says that's why, one big reason why we always begin with the first thing. The second reason, he says, also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there's very little disagreement about morality. Almost all people, all times, have agreed, in theory at least, that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. Right? You're not going to have much disagreement. And in fact, he'll say this, I think later he'll say there's much agreement at these levels. And then the further you go down, there's more and more disagreement as to what people, like right here, we can agree, don't stab, don't murder, don't steal, those sorts of things. Don't do things that are going to hurt each other. And we can all agree on what that looks like. More disagreement here, like, what is honesty? What do you mean by being honest? How tightly should I take care of myself and tidy up, right? And then much more disagreement at this level when it comes to the overall worldview. So if we stick to things, the thinking is, if we stick to this level, then we have things that are very, very obvious, and we have things that nobody really disagrees about. So why not just stop there, right? And in fact, I'd put a star here for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is, I put it to identify the one that Lewis says, is the one that most people think about, but also to identify this level is where most laws get made, actually. Most laws get made at this level. And I'd challenge you to think of an example. I'll give you one here in a second. But I'd challenge you to think of an example of a law whose rationale is not just playing nice with others, right? So think about all kinds of laws. Don't murder, don't steal. Those are all don't harm others, do good to others, right? Even taxes, right? I gotta pay my taxes. That's that second part, doing good to others. It's very rare that you find a law with a rationale that is anywhere other than that. Can you think, here's a challenge for yourself, pause this video and think about it. Can you think of a law whose primary rationale is at this level of morality to make sure that you don't hurt yourself or that you do good to yourself? Like, think about it, right? So you might have thought, like illegal drugs. That's a good guess, but I don't think that's quite right. Here's why. Because, well, I'm asking like the primary rationale. Why? And I don't think the primary rationale why hard drugs are illegal is because it has to do with this level. Like, well, we want to make sure that people are healthy, that they don't harm themselves, they do good. Like, I don't think it's at that level. Because imagine that being pitched to a legislative body to get it, made into law, right? So like the war on drugs, when it began, let's imagine how that conversation went. I don't think that it was at this level because I don't think that would have gotten passed if this was the argument. Hey, we want drug addicts to make sure that they're clean, that they don't hurt themselves, that they live a good life and, aren't taking bad drugs, right? I don't think that if you gave that argument, as good as that sounds, like, I don't think it would have gotten much public support in a Congress. However, I think it mostly has to do the illegal drugs argument with this. They tied it to something that was saying, look, it's harming others. They tied it to publicly observable bad actions like crime, and violence. And that was the primary rationale for why those laws were enacted. Now, it does have this secondary effect, but I don't think that this is the actual motive as to why illegal drugs were banned. Now, if you're still trying to think of an example, I think the best example would be seatbelt laws. Seatbelt laws, believe it or not, right here are a very good example of where the primary rationale is not at this level. It's not that I'm not harming others. That's why I wear a seatbelt. I want to make sure other people are safe. No, it's because I want to make sure myself is safe. I want to make sure I don't harm myself. Like, it's not going to hurt anybody more. Like, the only difference between wearing a seatbelt and wearing a seatbelt is if you crash, your body flies out the windshield. So that does more damage to you, not another person. Like, if you run into another person, your car has already hit them. Your body hitting them is not going to hurt them more. Like, that's not the reason for the law. The reason for the law, the rationale, the deep motive is to not harm oneself. And that's really interesting because, as I said, most laws are made at this level. You will rarely see that where the rationale for law, the primary rationale for law is at this level. But if you want to hear more about that, I'll do a video series on law, how it gets made, and we'll talk more about these 3 parts of morality as well with it. So what we just said, results of bad morality, why we always focus on the first part, why laws, we can add in there, why laws always get made at this first part, is because it's obvious and because there's very little disagreement at that level. However, you might be thinking, well, why not just stop there? He says here, although it's very natural to begin with all that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well not have thought at all. Unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being, we're only deceiving ourselves. He says, what is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions if, in fact, they're such crazy old tubs that cannot be steered at all? Let me give you an argument for, because you might still be thinking, I'm fine. Like, just live and let live, right? Laissez-faire sort of morality. Everybody mind their own business. As long as you're not hurting each other, who cares? But let me give you an argument, going back over here, as to why this second part is so darn essential, okay? And I want you to think of, for example, anytime like widespread corruption or bad stuff happens, say like a corporate corruption, like insider trading, like Enron or something, or with the banks, or so corporate corruption, or maybe like police brutality, okay? So think about that example. And then think to yourself, what happens after, like in the aftermath of such scandal and widespread corruption? Like, what do they do to fix it, let's say? Here's what they do. As we said before, most laws are made at this level, so that's kind of natural they would go with this. But they try to do this. They try to enact more policy, like more rules to live by. They say with police brutality, they install body cams, they install dash cams, they make officers go through sensitivity training, right? That's more policies, more rules to live by. But let me ask you this, wouldn't it just makes things so much simpler and nicer if instead of having new rules to follow, we just had better, morally good, upstanding people in those roles that would just follow the rules that were there already? Because if you put new rules in and you still have bad, morally corrupt people, then you're going to have cunning people who try to jump through the loopholes. He says right here, it is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying or cheating and so on that go on under the present system. But as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. They will find some way to jump through the hoops, as long as you have bad people. Or to take the example of corporate corruption, right? What do you see? You see new governance, you see new oversight, perhaps, if that. But that's all you really see. But wouldn't it be nice, instead of having more policies enacted, more rules for people to follow to make sure that they're doing the right things, not hurting people and paying everybody fair wage, wouldn't it be better and easier for your society if you just had morally good people as leaders who would just do those things naturally, who would pay their employees a fair wage and not, lay off people and so on? That would make for a much better treatment at this level. In other words, they would be good enough people to where they would follow the rules that were already in place. You wouldn't have to worry about adding new rules that people aren't going to follow. So, yeah, it would make life a lot easier. And so it kind of makes you wonder, why don't we focus more at this level then? Why don't we focus on hiring police officers who are just morally good? That's not on the application as far as I can tell. They might have psych evals, they may have background checks with stuff like, have you been arrested or you were charged with a felony and things? Okay. Have you broken rules? But that's at this level. Have you hurt other people? I don't see any applications that are what kind of person are you internally? Not that you've hurt other people, but are you a morally good, upstanding, not just good citizen where you help other people, but good person, right? It's where when we put you in this spot, you're just going to do the right thing naturally. That would solve a lot of problems. So it makes you wonder why we don't do that already. And so the $1 million question, we'll look at this in further videos, future videos, where we talk through law, like I said. This is the $5 million question. Why don't we do this as a society? And how? How do we get citizens who are morally good people? Yeah. Because that would solve a lot of problems if we were able to do that. So that's a short argument for that. It's not always about this. It's about this, and it would solve a lot of problems. But in his word, he says here, what's the good of telling the ships how to steer if they can't be steered at all, right? If their internal rigging is wrong. And he continues, what is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that, in fact, our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? In other words, why draw up all these new rules if you got bad apples who are just going to break the rules anyway or find a way around it? So he says, I'll read what I said earlier. He says, it's easy enough to remove particular kinds of graft and bullying that go on under the present system. This is what we're seeing now in our country with Doge. It's understandable that you would want to remove bloat and abuse and waste and so on. But it seems more than that. It's not just that they're wanting to remove waste, as in a company makes more streamlined profits, let's say, because they are trying kind of treating it like a company. But they're doing more than that. As you can see, Elon Musk is went in his tweets. He really does think he's on a kind of a moral crusade. The idea that he's ridding people of actual corruption, right? This was the same thing you saw in Trump's first term with draining the swamp. But there, in draining the swamp, it was more focused on the actual corruption, get that out and leave good. But now it's more let's let's break down and dismantle these systems and these agencies and these departments. But as Lewis says here, that's not going to fix things. Like, if you break all that down and dismantle those departments, those agencies, those systems, and you put new ones in their place, that changes nothing. Because if you continue to have people that are still morally corrupt and want to hide what they're doing, right here, as long as men are twisters and bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. If you don't root out morally corrupt people, right? Not just root out, find and root out, but also find ways to hire the good people, you're going to have a new policy, new system, but people still breaking the rules, still falling through, finding loopholes and so on. And he says here, you cannot make men good by law. And without good men, you cannot have a good society. It's sort of a paradox, you can't have it both ways. It's interesting because although Lewis says this, you cannot make men good by law, when I get into future videos, we will see, interestingly, that Aristotle has a different opinion about this. He thinks that you can. Both Aristotle and Aquinas, by the way. Aristotle is about 2,400 years ago, 2,500 years ago, and Aquinas is about 800 years ago. They both believe that you can. It won't happen overnight, but it's possible. So there's that disagreement. He says, that is why we must go on to think of the second thing, of morality inside the individual. But then he says, I don't think we can stop there either. We're now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. And it would seem, at first sight, very sensible to stop before we got there. Just carry on with partial morality, all sensible people can agree about, right? At least, certainly with the first one, right? All sensible people agree about not harming others. And then we can get on board with this too, because we want people to be morally good inside. We saw how important that was just now. But let's stop. There's no reason to go on to this entire differences of worldview where people have really strong disagreements that can be nasty sometimes. So why bring that up, Lewis? So he says, it would seem we could stop there. But can we? Remember that religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must be either true or false, right? Here's a statement of fact, a statement concerning a fact, right? It's a statement, not just of faith, but Jesus Christ rose from the dead, right? That's not just, hey, I like strawberry ice cream. It's not just expressing my preference to things. It is a statement concerning facts. That is, it could be true or false, a statement concerning the state of the world, and that statement can either be true or false. Did those sets of circumstances happen or not? All right. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That is making a claim about the world, which is either true or false. So if it's true, he says, because it must be true or false. If it's true, one set's conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they're false, quite a different set, as we saw before. For example, let's go back to the man who says a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other people. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But does it not make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it make a difference or not whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant, and somebody else is responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belong to myself. And so we will stop there, because this, if we continue, I'm not merely just hesitant because Lewis says, oh, maybe we should stop there, and people disagree. But this goes on to say, actually, let's keep going. He says, again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever, and this must either be true or false. Now, there are very good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse. So gradually, and the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable. So I can just sort of, I'll just live with it, cope, make sure I don't hurt people right here at this level. And then I don't really need to concern myself with this, because under the assumption I only live about 70 years, it's not, that sort of derivation of 1% over 70 years is not really going to all matter that much. So why improve it? Why waste my energies doing that? But he says, here's where the difference lies. If I'm not just going to be, not just live, but be in existence only for 70 years, but will be in existence for forever, that is going to make, he says, in his words, it might be absolute hell in a million years. He says, in fact, Christianity is true. Hell is precisely correct term for what it would be. C.S. Lewis has an interesting take on hell, by the way. You can see about this in a book called The Great Divorce. It has nothing to do with like husband and wife divorce, but he does give this, I think, here, and then I think there's probably some in another book called Till We Have Faces, where he gives an account of hell, where he believes, I think I forget which theologian or philosopher he's inheriting this view from, but he expresses it very well. That's why I would associate it with him. It's the view that the people in hell who are in hell are there because they don't want to be anywhere else. They don't want to get out. They sort of are so, you're probably thinking, oh, that sounds terrible. Why would anybody think that? But it rejects this sort of hell view where it's just fire and brimstone. You're, melting, burning alive in a lake of fire that we get from the 1300s with Dante. But, Dante was very creative in his portrayal of hell. And of course, that's carried on to the present day. But if you look at original sources, you have some of that, but sort of the fire and brimstone, that very phrase, right? Portraying hell, thrown into a lake of fire. But if you take that literally, you get what Dante gets. If you take that figuratively or metaphorically or analogously, that it would be kind of like that, but not literally like that, you get something like the view that Lewis holds, that it's not literally a fire and brimstone, but it seems like that because it's so torturous. Why would it be so torturous, and why would you not want out? Well, he holds it's sort of this dark place, again, analogously, metaphorically. It's this dark place that you just don't want out, and you are met with your sin. You are apart from your Creator, and you don't want to be anywhere near God because He disgusts you. I know that for some people, that sounds like hell, to be away from God. And in reality, it is. But for some people who love God, that would be terrible. But for the people who hate God, who want nothing to do with Him, that is their only solace, to be as far away from God as they can. And when you're far away from God, you are in a hell of your own making. You are away from love itself, from the pure love itself, from the origin of all existent things, the origin of all good things. And that's the great divorce. That's being split apart from your Maker. And it is hell. And the people who are there want to be there, and they don't want anywhere else. They don't want anywhere near God. So that's what he's describing here. He says, and immortality, he says, makes this other difference. He goes on, which by the way, has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or nation or civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or civilization compared with his is only a moment. Wow. Right. So this flies in the face of, he's of course, he's probably thinking, as was going on during this time in the 1940s, totalitarianism, communism, also in the Soviet Union. Yeah. But the idea that the state should live longer, the state should live on, individuals should sacrifice for the state, And as long as we have a good society, that's what matters, because a society will outlive you in your 70 years. But of course, here, if you were everlasting, then even Rome fell, folks. So he says here, it seems then, if we were to think about morality, we must think of all three departments: relations between man and man, things within inside each man, and relations between man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one. Disagreements begin with the second and become more serious with the third. It is dealing with the third that the main differences between Christian and non-Christian morality come out. Now, I have students who sometimes are very perturbed by, maybe they're mad at me, maybe they're just mad at Lewis, but like, why focus on Christianity? Yeah. Well, first of all, as I said at the beginning, it was requested of him that he speak on a particular religion, that is Christianity. He could have spoken about other religions, but he didn't. He wasn't asked to do that. And again, he's a representative of Christianity because he himself is Christian, and also because he was a convert to Christianity. So he could see it from the outside, and he can also see it from the inside. So he's a unique voice. Again, also a great writer, whose memorial footstone or flatstone is placed in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner, along with the likes of Shakespeare, Bronte, Charles Dickens, so on and so on. So he's an excellent writer. This is why they asked him to do this. He says things very lucidly, very clearly. And he's got good reason to give the case of Christianity here. But this I assign, even if we're not talking about Christianity at all, because it very clearly outlines, like I said, Lewis wasn't the originator of his three parts of morality. He inherited this view, but Christian or not, this three parts of morality is actually the frame can be put on to just any sort of religious or non-religious system of morality. So it's a really good way to think about morality, and we'll be using this in the future, the three parts of morality, when we talk through in the future videos on law, like I said. But yeah, that is it. Thanks for hanging in there. And final word, if you're not subscribed, let this be a reminder from my wife that you go and subscribe. She likes to see that things that I do go well. Of course, I do too, but here's a plea from her. She is very excited about all the people, as I am. I'm very excited to see so many people subscribe. But make sure, even if you're watching this video, and if you've gotten this far especially, please just take a moment, sit down there, hit a like, hit a comment. Let's talk through these things. I'd love to hear from you. I can't answer all things because I also teach as well, and I've got to do a lot of grading. I've got like 100 students this semester. But yeah, give me a subscribe. Please follow. And if you like to see this video, if you've got any recommendations, any future requests that you'd like to see, I'd also love to hear from that as well. So I've got a lot, kind of storehouse of things here and lessons that I want to get on video. But if you've got other things that you want to hear from, you'd like for me to treat, then please include those as well. I'd love to cover them. So, all right, I will see you later. Take care.